Well, again, I'm Chris Lee of Southeastern 14, joined by my good buddy Drew DeArmond, who knows Alabama football, baseball, basketball exceptionally well. We're going to talk about Alabama football post Nick Saban, Kalen DeBoer now in charge. Lots of stuff happening in the Alabama State in the aftermath of that. Drew's going to tell us all of it, or most of it. I don't think we get to all of it in an hour, but we're gonna try. Reminder: this brought to you by BetOnline. As we do this, it's playoff time. The road through Vegas goes through San Francisco and Baltimore. BetOnline is your number one source for playoff football odds, stats, trends, and lines. With everything from point spreads to hundreds of player performance props, head to BetOnline today. Stay updated on the action. BetOnline, the game starts here. Drew, thanks for joining us today. Let's go back. It's been a couple of weeks now, but I mean, we talked off air a lot. I'm thinking, boy, we need to make sure this all gets on the podcast here because it was great stuff. Nick Saban leaving, I know you weren't totally surprised. You thought it might happen. You weren't sure. He kept it all under wraps. Ultimately, when do you think Nick Saban knew he was leaving, and what were the determining factors?
Well, I was basically told that he started getting frustrated toward the end of this season. I think now that after talking to people behind the scenes at Kalen DeBoer's press conference, it really started back in October that he told Greg Byrne and some of the powers that be, hey, just be on the look. I'm not saying I'm doing it, but I'm saying that I could retire. So have a plan. And so they knew there was a chance it could happen. I think most people figured, though, that it wouldn't. Because, Coach, I felt like and I think I've told you on this show before, I thought he had 3 to 5 years left in him. I know he was 72, but he was in really good health, very high energy. And so I thought all year he seemed locked in. And I think he was till the bitter end. But I think, going into the stretch of the season, the last part of it, I just think it became a real grind for him. And then when you're having to reset and retool – and get ready in this transfer portal era, you're always going to have attrition to your roster. Recruiting is crazy in December. You've got NIL. I don't think NIL and the portal drove him out of coaching because, as he told Reese Davis, he told he did it for 3 years, but it's the totality of everything.
Yeah.
And he's 72 years old. He was trying to retain staff and rejigger his defensive staff because I think he admitted after the year, ended. Their defense was improved this year, I thought. But I think one of the first, flags that should have raised for people was when Kevin Steele retired because he had a 3-year contract. I thought Coach Steele would at least serve out 2 of those years. He retired first, and he had been an overseer and kind of helped Saban get the defense realigned. And I think I even said on the show during the season, we found out in early September, basically the defenses were being called by Travaris Robinson. And to me, that meant that they were trying to kind of groom him to eventually take over. And Nick Saban does that with a lot of coaches. But as he admitted after the season, I had to get much more heavily involved with the defense, probably than he originally wanted to. And I guess it was a little bit of a struggle. And then by the end of the season, when he reassessed things and he took a look at it, I think he felt like, okay, I'm going to have to make major changes on this defensive staff, like especially if Coach Steele were going to retire, which he did. So you don't have Kevin Steele there. You're going to have to hire a new DC. And it's ironic because he just got named the DC at Auburn, but the name we were hearing was DJ Durkin, he consulted with Nick Saban in the past. He had been a consultant when he left Maryland. He's from the Saban tree. He'd been with Will Muschamp. He'd been with Lane Kiffin. He was with Jimbo. So he was in that network. And, of course, Jeremy Pruitt's off the table because of the NCAA situation with Tennessee. So he was thinking about hiring DJ Durkin. And I think he wanted Durkin to probably call the defenses. And then he wanted Travaris Robinson to be a co-DC, get bumped up in title and pay. But the problem is I think Travaris wanted to be the defensive coordinator. And Nick Saban's made calls like this before. He didn't think Sal Sunseri was ready to do it. He was not. Tosh Lupoy, that was early on when Pete Golding was at Alabama. He took the defensive, signal calling away from Tosh and gave it to Pete. So he's made these calls before. but I think he was trying to get Travaris Robinson to stay, but T-Rob wanted to go to Georgia because, let's be honest, there's a lot of tampering that goes on, and Kirby knew he could get Travaris Robinson. He ironically makes him the co-DC and safeties coach, and I think they wanted Caleb Downs because they missed on him the first time. It didn't work out because Gary Downs, Caleb's dad, had a close relationship with the secondary coach at Ohio State. They had finished in probably second to Alabama in his recruitment, Georgia probably third. So he ends up going to Ohio State because Saban's gone. If Saban had not retired, I think Caleb probably stays, even with T-Rob leaving. But again, I just think overall, and then Coach Saban, I was told he tried to hire Bo Davis, and Bo went back home to LSU because a lot of these coaches were leery of Coach Saban not being there more than a year. And then if you're under a multi-year contract, where are you going to be? And so I think all of that, the totality of it for Coach Saban, the trying to retain staff, trying to hire coaches, and dealing with the transfer portal and NIL. And he only had 8 offensive linemen on scholarship going into spring. He didn't like where his offensive tackle spot necessarily was because he couldn't get Jordan Seaton. Jordan Seaton went to Colorado. So I think everything just in its totality just sort of made him sit back and think, okay, maybe I just don't have the energy to do it anymore. I can do it, but I'm not going to cut corners to do it. I'm not going to become a CEO or a figurehead. I only know one way to do it. And so he was interviewing a coach for the open wide receiver spot where Holman Wiggins had left to go to Texas A&M. And then in the next, 10, 15 minutes, he's on the phone with his wife saying, okay, I'm about to go into this team meeting and I may retire. And so, and she's like, if you want to do it one more year, if you decide you want to do that, I'm all for it. If you walk in and retire, we will definitely support you there too. So, and I'll just tell you this, because a lot of people talked about it, Chris, the team didn't know, the coaches didn't know. Only Greg Byrne, as I previously mentioned, and some board of trustee members and some power brokers knew this might happen. And so he walks into the room, and I had been told to circle back that day that he did it. I got a text from someone that's a collegiate coach that told me, hey, did you know Travaris Robinson is going to Georgia? And that was my first red flag. I said, yeah. What? And he said, that makes no sense. I would think that Coach Saban would want to retain him. He's like, well, as of noon today, that's what's happening. And he's leaving. And I was like, wow, that would be major. Now he goes, now things can change, and Coach Saban may figure it out, but he's getting a little frustrated. And then we just talked about Bo Davis. That afternoon, Bo Davis went to LSU, and I said, man, I would have thought Coach would have had interest in Bo Davis if he was going to leave Texas. And then he got back to me and said, oh, he tried. But he said Bo was leery about him, retiring. And so, and so I think everything just sort of, snowballed for Coach Saban. And he just decided, look, I'm leaving this place in a great spot. And then it just so happened too, I know the transfer portal we opened for Alabama, and we're going to talk about that because of him leaving. But recruiting was basically done. Except for Ryan Williams, and we'll talk about that. And so they were in a good spot from the standpoint if this was a time to retire, it was probably good because again, I always kind of thought, and I was wrong, that he would do it. Maybe it would be kind of leaked out in the middle of the season, like this will be Nick Saban's last, and give them a time to hire a head coach and get in there and try to salvage recruiting. But in a way, this was even better because he had signed the number 2 class. 90% of them were early enrollees, and we did see Julian Sayin and Jameer Grimsley move on, but the majority of them have stayed. And I think it's a credit to Greg Byrne and the athletic department for how quickly they executed the Kalen DeBoer search. And let's be honest, when Nick Saban was hired back in 2007, Alabama job wasn't considered a plum job. But now with Nick Saban retiring, what he did in 17 years, it's the by far and away the number 1 program in the country, in my opinion, when it comes to what they give you resource-wise, their history and everything. And so they were able to get a guy like Kalen DeBoer to leave a $9 million contract extension on his desk at Washington to come to Alabama because it's Alabama. I mean, come on. Washington is a great place. He did an amazing job going 25-3. But think about it. His recruiting base expands. It's the Alabama brand. And if you're Kalen DeBoer and you're comfortable in your own skin, and I think that's the key for him, that Alabama gives you every advantage you need he got to the national championship game, but he wants to win it. And if you want to win the national championship in this expanded playoff era coming up, then you're going to need even more resources than Washington was potentially able to give you.
Okay, when the news broke, a lot of us went to the usual, not the usual suspects, but the names that made sense. Okay, Lane Kiffin would have been on there. Dan Lanning would have been on there. Steve Sarkisian would have been on there. Sarkisian, I think, based on you and I's conversation off mic, tires, I guess, got kicked there, and it wasn't going to happen. Maybe it's fair to say. I'll let you put your words to it in a second. It sounds like Kiffin and Lanning were never considered. Is that fair?
Yes, extremely fair. Lane wanted the job, still does, but he didn't leave on the greatest of terms at the University of Alabama, and so he was not going to get the job. I was certain of that. And then and Steve Sarkisian is well thought of in Tuscaloosa. They certainly kicked the tires on him to see if he would be interested. I think his wife loves Austin. He's in a great spot. They just made the playoff. They're giving him what he wants. And so I just think overall, they knew quickly, okay, because you have to have a plan A, plan B, C, D. So they're like, he's not, we know it's not going to be him. But they had strong indication from Jimmy Sexton and Kalen DeBoer that he was going to be very interested in the job. So, I heard that they were basically the next day. I mean, he retired on a Wednesday and just shocked everyone. And then, and I'll tell you guys a funny story for your listeners, because as I told you, I got tipped off at about 2:00 in the afternoon that he was frustrated. And I was even told 50-50 he may retire. And I'm like, wow, that would be crazy. But I've been told he's been frustrated before by the same source, and he's always worked it out. He's always, ended up figuring his staff out, figuring out what he wanted to do. And so it was 2:00. Me and the media member that I'm very close with had found out there's a team meeting at 4:00. Okay, great. Okay. But what we were thinking was it was to set the agenda for next year for the off-season program, and then, and also for the spring practice, and everything would be fine. And so that was a bad time to take a nap, because I just sort of let it out.
What a great story off air, by the way.
And then I wake up and I've got 6 missed calls and 88 text messages in an hour and a half. And then I'm like, whoa. And so somebody had told me to check out Chris Lowe. I checked out Chris Lowe. I'm like, holy cow. He actually went into the team meeting and retired. And so then for the next 72 hours, you're basically just chasing information. And you mentioned the obvious candidate. The first one that popped into my head was Dan Lanning, because he was a Saban tree. He had gotten back in 14, he was one of the analysts. There was about 4 or 5 analysts that worked under Wesley Neighbors, who's now the safeties coach for Lane Kiffin, ironically, at Ole Miss. Lanning was one of them. He had success at Oregon, and had been really good in the portal from a recruiting standpoint, and recruited well nationally. So it's all about timing. But I thought, okay, he took his name out of Texas A&M. I don't think he would. I was told that Alabama and Georgia were probably the 2 jobs where he would leave Oregon for. And he's young, he's in his late 30s, whatever. So, and this is a young man's game right now. And so I'm thinking Dan Lanning's probably number 1. And, and then I gotten, myself and another media member had gotten some information that he potentially could be in Tuscaloosa or on his way on Wednesday night. That ended up being erroneous. And then that was kind of chasing ghosts. And then after that, on Thursday, when things started popping, I found out, that Nick Saban had basically, what had happened was that Alabama had been in Houston, and I think, and when I first heard Houston, the first thing, because I had been trying to connect dots, I thought, well, that could mean
Nick Rines.
But he's on a playoff run. He was preparing for a game on that Saturday that he ended up winning. And so within this portal era, if you have to wait an extra week, that's really tough. And so, but then in the back of my mind, I was like, who else they could be talking to? Steve Sarkisian could meet them in Houston easily, which I think basically they talked to Sark in Houston. And then after that, they jumped to it. And then by Thursday, they were in Seattle. And when I was told they were in Seattle, I was like, they're going after DeBoer. He's the dude. And I was assured that he had high interest in the job. And there were some people that thought he was going to use it as leverage, but I just never did. I just thought, this is the only chance he's probably going to have this job if Alabama gets it right. And so, and he's taken Washington as far as he can take them. He's gone 25-3. He played for the national championship, came up short, but he can win it all at Alabama. And so they quickly hashed out everything. We all know it broke on Friday, and then he ended up being introduced on Saturday. So it was a whirlwind, kind of 72 hours. But I give Greg Byrne a lot of credit, and really it was 48 hours. But he nailed it, and he got one of the best coaches in the country. And I was there at the press conference. I've been around him a little bit. He's definitely has a more laid back personality than Nick Saban, but I think he's very genuine, very authentic. I thought when he broke down on the stage, being after in the introductory press conference, it was real. I mean, because he hated having to leave Washington in some ways because he had done a lot in 2 years and cleaned up that mess that Jimmy Lake had left, where they were 4-8, the NCAA was sniffing around. And then later on, somebody did leak out his final team meeting with Washington. It said a lot to me. A lot of times when a coach leaves, there's hard feelings. There's like, why are you leaving us? He spoke to his team and they gave him a standing ovation and he was walking out the door. So
wow.
I thought that was significant that they thought that much of him. And I would give him an A so far, Chris, on how he's handled things, the staff he's put together. And, again, Nick Saban is the greatest of all time. But I will say, as his age crept up and in the last, 5 years or so, I don't think he was able to put together as good a coaching staff as he wanted to. And I don't think especially defensively. I think that's why Alabama kind of fell off a little bit. You started to see some improved play this year, but certainly I think defense is kind of what slipped. And again, I think part of that was Nick Saban's age and being used against him. But and when you can't ever bring back the same staff, and he didn't in 17 years, which is remarkable, it's just very, very difficult. And when they continue to change things, and you got NIL, you got the transfer portal, it makes things so hard to keep your roster together. What he did, I think, is even more remarkable. And now that Kalen DeBoer, the cool thing is, though, Kalen DeBoer rebuilt Washington quickly through the portal and through some really savvy recruiting. He'll have a bigger recruiting base at Alabama. He's still done really well in the portal, and he brought Courtney Morgan with him to be the general manager of Alabama football that he had hired away from Michigan. And we saw the roster that Washington was able to put together. It was probably the fourth most talented in the playoff. But as I told some folks, after Dan Lanning wasn't hired and neither was Sark, but you look at his record in the last 2 years against Sark, Lanning, and Riley is 7-0. And he didn't probably have as much talent as they did, and yet he outcoached him.
Greg Byrne's fantastic. I think if there's a better athletic director in the country, I'm not saying he's the best, but I can't think of one that I like a lot better. The thing that, and this too, the thing he's very unpredictable. And he kind of put it out there before the search that, hey, whatever you hear, whatever you think, you're going to be wrong. Wait to hear it from me. And he went and did it again. What was the particular attraction or connection with Kalen DeBoer?
Well, I think he has a lot of connections out on the West Coast, as you know. I mean, he was at Arizona for a long time. So there's a lot of people he can call and vet that he trusts. And then as he told us, you always have a list in your drawer because you never know when it's going to happen. Like, okay, who are some guys that I could vet and go after? And so there are always, options. And so I think he had some outstanding, and like he told us, he had started following Kalen DeBoer. And here's the ironic part. My one claim to fame in the Nick Saban era of his dynasty in Tuscaloosa is the little soundbite I was involved in back when they played Fresno State, and I believe it was 2017, when I asked him about the offensive line play and never expecting, and Coach would do this, and if he was in a certain mood, he would throw it back at you. And when he threw it back at me and said, well, what did you think of the offensive line play? And I said, well, Coach, I thought it was so-so. He put his glasses on. He said, well, if I think it's so-so when I watch the film Monday, then I'll come back and I'll just hire your ass. And it was on the front of ESPN and everything. And I mean, it's the one interaction with Saban that I had during my career in this, and I've been in this nearly 10 years now. And here's the irony of how things tie back in together. I never even thought about it until we were interviewing and talking to DeBoer after the press conference when they let the media speak with him behind closed doors. He was the offensive coordinator in that game for Fresno State. Like Byrne said, that was his first time being in the same building with DeBoer. He didn't know him, though. He really didn't know him until they went to Seattle to start talking with him. But he, of course, heard things and saw things like everybody else did, and vetted him through, his contacts and in collegiate athletics. But yeah, I mean, it was crazy because Jeff Tedford is a very close friend of his. And I had asked Coach DeBoer behind closed doors, who influenced you the most as far as your offensive philosophy? Because they throw the football. I mean, they were first and second in the country in passing yards per game his 2 years at Washington. And I just wanted to pick his brain. And Tedford is one of the first guys he mentioned. And that's when he mentioned that game. And I thought, wow, I never even – that's so funny how things get tied together. He said, yeah, we had a little bit of success. It wasn't the outcome we wanted. It was a very tough night. But I've been to Tuscaloosa. I've seen what Coach Saban has built. And then, of course, that's the reason he ended up being the head coach at Fresno, because of the success he had at OC there under Jeff Tedford, and then what he did at Indiana under Tom Allen. So it's just been a very interesting process. And certainly I think it was as good a hire as Alabama could make. I mean, I know I've been asked that many times. And there's different ways to skin a cat. I mean, he's not going to be, as fire and ice as Nick Saban. Nick Saban is one of the most intense, driven people you're ever going to be around. But there's different ways to skin a cat. I think he connects with players, and that's what it's all about this day and time. You have to connect with the student athlete on a personal level, because they're going to have opportunities, man, especially until they get guardrails put up with this NIL and transfer portal. It's basically free agency without contracts every year. So you have to give players a reason to stay. You have to treat them well, and you have to develop them and give them a conduit to get to the NFL, because that's what they want to do. And he's done that at Washington in a remarkable way. And here's, it's a small world after all. He's the first Washington coach to play for a national championship since Don James. And Don James
was connected to Saban. Yeah,
exactly. He coached Nick Saban at Kent State. And so it's just so funny how large but how small the college coaching fraternity can be too, and how things can come full circle.
Okay, what of Nick Saban's stamp remains in the program with Kalen DeBoer in charge? What changes?
Well, I mean, he's going to keep David Ballou, Ellis Ponder, Bob Welton, a lot of the Clinton Dix, Denzel Duvall, Josh Chapman, a lot of the off-field guys are staying in that regard. Now the coaching staff, he's only keeping on the field Robert Gillespie, running backs coach, and that's strategic because it's one of the two most talented spots on the team. Because you've got Jam Miller, you got Justice Haynes, you got Richard Young, you got two guys they signed, Kevin Riley and Daniel Hill. You're trying to keep all those guys because, as we've already seen with Julian Sand and Jameer Grimsley, just because you signed and just because you even went through bowl practices, you can leave. You can ask and go into the transfer portal. So again, but it's going to be a completely different dynamic, completely different offensive system. Kane Womack is going to run a 4-2-5. It's going to be interesting to see how they utilize the personnel. What I've been having to do is reprogram myself, because when I was trying to figure out, okay, what's he going to do with his defensive coaching staff? What's he going to do offensively? It was always Nick Saban's offense, Nick Saban's defense, Nick Saban's special teams. And he would give the new coordinators his playbooks. That's out the door. Okay. They're doing everything different, and they should, because again, Alabama got caught into the trap of with Coach Bryant, retired in 1982. And then the unfortunate part for Ray Perkins, and Ray admitted this, is that Coach passed away. because Coach could have been a buffer for a lot of things. Probably would have advised Ray, hey, Ray, it's not a great idea to take the tower down and make people mad, and because Ray admitted that. So, he would have been a really good resource for Ray to bounce things off of. And I think it's big that Coach Saban, and he's already been back and forth. He's been, playing golf. And then, hey, congratulations, he's earned it. I mean, I'll tell you how big a twilight zone it felt like. I mean, I've been covering Nick Saban for nearly a decade. My friend Ryan Fowler covered him for all 17 years of his career. We are trying to go to eat after the press conference with Kalen DeBoer. I leave my phone on top of my vehicle. Luckily, my vehicle's parked over across the street from Bryant-Denny Stadium. And I'm like, hey, man, I can't go without my phone. As we've already talked about on this long diatribe, your phone at that point in time is irreplaceable. I said, I got to go get my phone. I think I either put it in the seat or I left it on the roof. And we go back there, and as we're on our way, we're going through an intersection, and all of a sudden Ryan Fowler goes, wow, there goes Nick Saban and Miss Terry. We both got cricks in our neck because there he went across the intersection in a Mercedes going somewhere away from the football building in public. And we're sitting there thinking, wow, this is the twilight zone. Nick Saban is not running the Alabama football program anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, and we get back, and sure enough, my phone's on the top of the car. And so then we go back and eat. And so it's just nuts because, you cover the guy for, his entire career. And he has a run that's unprecedented in the sport. Won 6 national championships, could have won double figures. The consistency was just stunning. But just to know that he's not there, but it's also exciting because Kalen DeBoer, if anybody that watched his Washington team play could see that they were extremely well coached offensively. They struggled a little bit on the defensive side of the ball, but guess what? He's going to be at Alabama. And no disrespect to what he left. I think he's only going to bring one defensive coach, William Inge, who has not been officially announced. I think he's probably going to be the final on-field coach as outside linebackers and special teams. But he got a better defensive staff. Kane Womack, who'd worked with him at Indiana, they were OC and DC together, is an outstanding defensive mind. And then Mo Lindquist, the standing head coach at Buffalo, he brings him in as a cornerbacks coach, co-DC. He is one of these guys that had been in the NFL, known as a heck of a recruiter. He took a tough job at Buffalo as a young coach, but had some success. And I think when you look at him and Colin Hitzler, the young man they were able to get from Wisconsin, who's known as a young energy guy, a safeties coach that's got a lot of recruiting chops. And again, I love Luke Fickell. He coached with Luke Fickell at Cincinnati, and we saw how good that secondary was, and at Wisconsin. I think he hired some really good defensive coaches that are going to be better than what he had at Washington. And you're going to have better talent. And so when you find that, I just think he's going to have a chance to do a lot of damage. I mean, in a perfect world, if you're the University of Alabama, who you just hired is this generation's Steve Spurrier.